August 16th, 1957, 10:32 p.m. The Apollo Theater, Harlem. 300 people filled the seats, and every single one of them knew what was about to happen. Raymond "King" Ray Morrison stood on stage under the spotlight, microphone in hand, wearing a white suit that cost more than most families made in a year. He was 6'3", 240 pounds of muscle and arrogance, and he'd spent the last 6 months building his reputation as the man who was going to dethrone Bumpy Johnson. "Where is he?" King Ray shouted into the microphone, his voice echoing through the theater. "Where's the so-called King of Harlem?" The crowd murmured, shifted in their seats, glanced toward the back entrance where Bumpy Johnson had been seen walking in 15 minutes earlier. King Ray had sent word through every street corner, every policy bank, every hustler in Harlem that tonight was the night Bumpy would answer for his crimes against the community, for taking too much, for ruling too long, for forgetting where he came from. The demand was simple and humiliating. Bumpy Johnson would walk onto that stage, get on his knees in front of 300 witnesses, and publicly acknowledge that King Ray Morrison was the new power in Harlem. If Bumpy refused, King Ray had 20 armed men positioned throughout the theater, and the message would be delivered in blood. What King Ray didn't know, what nobody in that theater except 3 people knew, was that Bumpy Johnson had been planning this moment for 6 weeks. To understand what happened on that stage at the Apollo Theater, you need to understand who Raymond Morrison was and how he'd gotten bold enough to challenge the most dangerous man in Harlem. King Ray had come up fast, too fast for anyone to track properly until it was almost too late. He was originally from Detroit, a numbers runner who'd worked for the Purple Gang until things got too hot, and he relocated to New York in early 1956. He was smart, charismatic, and most importantly, he understood something about power that most young hustlers didn't. Perception matters more than reality. Within 6 months of arriving in Harlem, King Ray had opened 3 after-hours clubs, started his own small numbers operation on the edges of Bumpy's territory, and began throwing money around like he owned the Federal Reserve. He paid people's rent, bought groceries for struggling families, showed up at church on Sundays with envelopes full of cash for the collection plate, and everywhere he went, he talked about how Bumpy Johnson had gotten old, had gotten soft, had forgotten about the people who made him king. By summer of 1957, King Ray had a following, mostly young men in their 20s who'd never lived through the wars that built Harlem's underworld, who saw Bumpy as a relic from another era and King Ray as the future. King Ray fed that narrative carefully, never directly threatening Bumpy, but always positioning himself as the alternative, the new generation, the man who understood what Harlem needed now. Then, in late July, King Ray made his move. He sent word to Bumpy through an intermediary that it was time for the old king to step aside, that Harlem deserved fresh leadership, and that if Bumpy wanted to avoid bloodshed, he should meet King Ray at the Apollo Theater on August 16th and publicly pass the crown. The message was delivered by a young runner named Marcus, barely 20 years old, who stood in Bumpy's office above Small's Paradise and repeated King Ray's words with the nervous confidence of someone who didn't fully understand what he was doing. Bumpy listened without interrupting, his face calm and unreadable, then asked Marcus a single question. "How much is King Ray paying you?" $50 a week, Mr. Johnson." Bumpy opened his desk drawer, pulled out $500, and placed it on the desk. "You're going to keep working for King Ray. You're going to tell him I received his message, and you're going to tell him I'll be at the Apollo on August 16th. Marcus stared at the money.
And what do you want me to do for this? Just keep your eyes open and tell me everything you see. For the next 3 weeks, Marcus reported back to Bumpy every other day with details about King Ray's operation, which clubs he owned, which cops he'd bribed, which policy banks were feeding him information, and most importantly, who his 20 armed men were and where they'd be positioned inside the Apollo Theater on the night of August 16th. Bumpy didn't just listen, he made his own moves, quiet ones that King Ray would never see coming, because King Ray was too busy building his public image to pay attention to the foundation crumbling beneath him. August 16th, 1957, 9:47 p.m. Bumpy Johnson arrived at the Apollo Theater through the front entrance, not the back, and he came alone. He was wearing a dark gray suit, perfectly tailored, with a black fedora and a gold watch chain that caught the light as he walked through the lobby. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who'd ruled Harlem for 25 years and had no intention of kneeling to anyone. The theater was packed, standing room only, and the air was thick with tension and anticipation. People had been talking about this moment for weeks, had placed bets on whether Bumpy would actually show up, whether he'd kneel, whether blood would be spilled on the Apollo stage.
King Ray's men were everywhere, positioned along the walls, in the balcony, near the exits, all of them armed and waiting for the signal. King Ray himself was backstage with his inner circle, pacing like a boxer before a championship fight, running through his speech one more time, the speech that would mark the beginning of his reign and the end of Bumpy Johnson's. At 10:15 p.m., Bumpy walked down the center aisle toward the stage while conversations stopped mid-sentence and heads turned to follow his movement. He didn't rush, didn't hesitate, just moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd walked into worse situations and walked out alive. When Bumpy reached the front row, he stopped and took a seat in the center, directly in King Ray's line of sight. He removed his fedora, placed it on his lap, and waited. King Ray got word that Bumpy had arrived, and at 10:32 p.m., he walked onto the stage with his microphone and his white suit and his 20 armed men watching from the shadows. "Where is he?" King Ray shouted. "Where's the so-called King of Harlem?" Bumpy stood up slowly, smoothed his jacket, and began walking toward the stage stairs. The entire theater held its breath. Bumpy climbed the stairs with deliberate calm, his footsteps echoing on the wooden stage, and when he reached the center, he stopped 10 feet from where King Ray stood. The spotlight caught both of them now, 2 men standing in front of 300 witnesses who would carry this story for the rest of their lives. King Ray smiled, the kind of smile that comes from thinking you've already won. "Bumpy Johnson, you actually came." "You invited me. Would have been rude not to show up." The crowd murmured, uncertain whether to laugh. King Ray stepped closer, still holding the microphone. "You know why you're here. You know what needs to happen. Harlem has moved on, old man. Your time is done. So I'm going to give you a choice right now in front of all these people." He gestured to the crowd. "You can get on your knees, acknowledge that I'm the new power in this neighborhood, and walk out of here with your dignity intact. Or," he paused for effect, "or we can do this the hard way." His 20 men shifted positions, hands moving toward their weapons. Bumpy looked at King Ray for a long moment, then looked out at the crowd, his eyes moving slowly across the faces of people he'd known for decades, people he'd helped, people who'd watched him build Harlem into something more than just a neighborhood. Then Bumpy spoke, his voice low but carrying across the theater without amplification. "You want me to kneel? That's right here, right now." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Before I do that,
I got a question. King Ray's falter slightly faded. What question?
Those 20 men you got positioned around this theater, the ones with guns, the ones ready to kill me if I don't do what you say? Bumpy paused. You trust them? King Ray's expression hardened. Every single one. You sure about that? I pay them well. They're loyal. Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket. Every one of King Ray's men tensed, hands gripping weapons. But Bumpy pulled out a white envelope and tossed it onto the stage floor between them. Open it. King Ray stared at the envelope, then at Bumpy, then bent down slowly and picked it up. He opened it with one hand while keeping his eyes on Bumpy, pulled out a single photograph and looked at it. His face went pale. The photograph showed one of King Ray's most trusted lieutenants, a man named Curtis, who was supposed to be watching the west exit, sitting in a diner 2 days earlier across from Julius, Bumpy's oldest associate, shaking hands over coffee. That's Curtis, Bumpy said quietly. One of your 20. Been on my payroll for 3 weeks. King Ray's hands started shaking. Bumpy continued, his voice still calm, still quiet. You want to know how many others? Check your north exit. Guy named Deshawn. He's been working for me since July. The 2 men in the balcony, both mine. The man standing behind you right now. King Ray spun around to see Marcus, the young runner who'd been delivering messages, standing in the stage wings with his hands in his pockets. He's been telling me everything for 3 weeks, Bumpy said quietly. The theater was absolutely silent now, so quiet you could hear the lights humming overhead. King Ray's breathing was getting faster, his confidence crumbling in real time. You're bluffing. Am I? Bumpy took a step closer. Call them. Call your men. Tell them to show their weapons. Let's see who moves and who doesn't. King Ray's mouth opened, but no words came out because he suddenly understood what had happened. Understood that while he'd been planning a public execution, Bumpy Johnson had been quietly buying loyalty, turning soldiers, and building a trap that King Ray had walked into willingly. Bumpy's voice dropped even lower. You came to Harlem 6 months ago thinking you could build an empire because you threw some money around and made some speeches. But you don't understand how power works here. It's not about who talks the loudest. It's about who people trust when everything falls apart. He gestured to the crowd. These people, they've known me for 25 years. I've paid their rent when they couldn't. I've protected their businesses when corrupt cops tried to shake them down. I've made sure their kids could walk to school without getting caught in somebody's war. You think a few free meals and some cash at church makes you their king? King Ray was shaking now, the microphone slipping in his sweating palm. Bumpy took another step closer. You wanted me to kneel. You wanted to humiliate me in front of 300 people. So here's what's going to happen instead. You're going to get on your knees. You're going to apologize to every person in this theater for wasting their time. And then you're going to leave Harlem tonight and never come back. And if I don't? King Ray's voice cracked. Bumpy didn't answer with words. He simply looked up at the balcony, then at the exits, then at the stage wings where Marcus stood. One by one, the men who were supposed to be King Ray's security, the 20 soldiers who were supposed to enforce his rule, stepped forward into the light where everyone could see them. And they did nothing. They didn't raise their weapons. They didn't move to protect King Ray. They just stood there, making it clear through their silence whose side they were really on. King Ray's legs gave out. He dropped to his knees in the center of the Apollo stage, his white suit now looking like a surrender flag, and the microphone fell from his hand, hitting the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the theater. I'm sorry, King Ray whispered, his voice barely audible. Louder, Bumpy said. I'm sorry, King Ray shouted, tears streaming down his face now. I'm sorry for disrespecting you, for disrespecting Harlem, for thinking I could... His voice broke completely. Bumpy looked at him with something that might have been pity, might have been contempt. It was hard to tell. Stand up. King Ray struggled to his feet. You've got 1 hour to get out of Harlem. Take whatever you can carry. Leave the clubs, leave the money, leave everything. And if I ever hear your name in this neighborhood again, if I even hear that you looked in this direction from wherever you end up, those 20 men who didn't protect you tonight will come find you. Do you understand? King Ray nodded, unable to speak. Go. Raymond Morrison walked off the Apollo stage with his head down, his white suit wrinkled and stained with sweat, and he pushed through the crowd toward the exit while 300 people watched in absolute silence. Nobody moved to help him. Nobody even looked at him. He was already a ghost. When the door closed behind him, Bumpy picked up the fallen microphone and handed it to the stage manager. Show's over. Thank you all for coming. Then Bumpy Johnson walked down the stage stairs, put his fedora back on, and walked out the same front entrance he'd come through. Raymond King Ray Morrison was on a bus to Philadelphia by midnight. He never returned to New York, never tried to rebuild what he'd lost, never spoke publicly about what happened at the Apollo Theater. He died in 1983 in a boarding house in Baltimore, and his obituary was 3 sentences long. The 20 men who'd been positioned throughout the theater that night, the ones Bumpy had quietly turned over 3 weeks, most of them stayed in Harlem and continued working in the neighborhood under different arrangements. They understood something King Ray never did. Loyalty isn't purchased with money. It's built through time, consistency, and the understanding that when power shifts, you need to know who'll still be standing when the dust settles. Within a week, the 3 after-hours clubs King Ray had opened were quietly absorbed into other operations. The policy banks he'd started running were shut down or integrated into existing networks. It was as if Raymond Morrison had never existed at all, and Harlem went back to business as usual. But the story of what happened at the Apollo Theater spread through New York's underworld like fire through dry paper. By the end of the month, every hustler, every mobster, every crew from the Bronx to Brooklyn had heard some version of it, and the lesson was always the same. Bumpy Johnson doesn't fight battles he hasn't already won. Frank Costello heard the story and nodded with something like professional respect. Vito Genovese heard it and decided that whatever plans he'd been considering for Harlem could wait another decade. Even the younger generation of hustlers, the ones who'd been watching King Ray's rise and thinking maybe it was time for new leadership, understood that challenging Bumpy Johnson required more than ambition and charisma. It required knowing how to read the board before you made your move. And Raymond Morrison had never even looked at the board. The Apollo Theater stayed open for decades after that night, hosting legends and launching careers, and Table 12 in the VIP section was eventually removed during a renovation in 1974. But old-timers who worked there in the late 50s would sometimes point to a spot on the stage, right near center, and tell younger employees about the night a man in a white suit knelt in front of 300 people while Bumpy Johnson stood over him without raising his voice or his fists. Some of the younger staff would ask what Bumpy did to make King Ray kneel, expecting a story about violence or threats, and the old-timers would shake their heads. He didn't make him kneel, they'd say. King Ray knelt because by the time he got on that stage, he'd already lost. He just didn't know it until Bumpy showed him. That's how power works when you understand it completely, when you've spent decades building it brick by brick, relationship by relationship, favor by favor. It's not about the moment on stage, it's about the 1,000 invisible moves that happened before anyone even walked through the door. Raymond Morrison learned that lesson too late, and Bumpy Johnson never had to teach it again.